This is a summary of what China provided to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam during the two wars against France and the United States. Besides military aid, China also supported Vietnam economically, financially, in healthcare, education, technical warehouses, medicine, radar, communication equipment, and various other military supplies. The total estimated value of China's aid to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam across these two wars was around $20 billion. However, despite all Mao Zedong's efforts to make Vietnam a buffer zone to protect China's security perimeter and to strengthen the communist bloc's influence in the region and globally, Vietnam ultimately leaned increasingly towards the Soviet Union, leading to China's isolation in the region. So why did Mao Zedong lose Vietnam? Firstly, let's discuss why Mao Zedong allocated a large amount of money to support the Democratic Republic of Vietnam instead of focusing on developing China during its difficult times. The primary reason was Vietnam's geopolitical location. In the complex geopolitical context of the 20th century, the American military presence in Southeast Asia posed a direct threat to China, making Vietnam a critical strategic point. Vietnam, positioned at the center of Southeast Asia and bordering China's southern boundary, not only served as a gateway to the region, but also as an important area for China to avoid the risk of invasion. With its geopolitical position, Vietnam was considered China's first line of defense. Thus, Mao Zedong's goal was not just to help Vietnam achieve independence, but also to protect China itself, promoting and affirming its leadership role within the communist movement. In terms of the communist movement of the time, we must also mention the two major players, China and the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong not only wanted China to become a communist superpower, but also aspired for it to lead the global communist movement. By continuously providing aid to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Mao Zedong sought to send a strong message to the international community about the unity and resolve of communist nations. A final reason, though equally significant, was China's own interests. Let's look back at the historical context. In 1949, after a civil war, China was just beginning to rebuild itself, but peace was short-lived. In 1950, China joined the Korean War to support North Korea against South Korea and United Nations forces, as Mao Zedong did not want the United States to approach China's borders. However, this action angered the West, resulting in an embargo against China. By 1954, Mao Zedong began to develop China's military industry, which required various embargoed materials from the West, such as heat and pressure-resistant materials, chemicals, explosive materials, nuclear-related technology, and high-tech machinery. He devised a bold plan to extend the Vietnam War, thus draining French resources while helping the Democratic Republic of Vietnam gain leverage at the negotiating table. At that moment, Mao would assist in negotiating favorable terms for France, creating a political exchange between France and China, which might include the embargoed materials China needed. This background shows that China's aid to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was not coincidental. However, why did Mao Zedong ultimately fail in his efforts? As expected, the Dien Bien Phu victory gave Vietnam a stronger position, allowing it to negotiate directly with France. Mao understood that continued warfare could escalate international tensions and possibly deepen U.S. involvement beyond mere assistance to France. This contradicted China's goal of ensuring national security. Mao Zedong wanted the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to sign a ceasefire agreement. However, the Vietnamese leadership was reluctant, as Vietnam held a strong battlefield position and could achieve more by continuing the fight. Yet China's Premier Zhou Enlai made it clear that China would cease aid if Vietnam did not agree to a ceasefire. Consequently, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam had no choice but to accept the Geneva Accords, temporarily dividing the country along the 17th parallel. This decision, however, complicated the relationship between the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, creating mutual suspicion and caution. Meanwhile, during the Geneva Accords, a Chinese official representing Beijing expressed a desire to engage in talks with France to establish relations, requesting that the discussions be kept confidential. China aimed to extend these discussions beyond Indochina issues, touching on East-West matters, including China's desire for French influence on the United States, assistance in joining the United Nations, and easing the embargo on strategic materials. This approach pleased France, eventually leading to its official recognition of the People's Republic of China in 1964. At this point, Vietnam realized that continued dependence on China would bind its decisions to China's interests. Meanwhile, relations between the Soviet Union and China had soured, altering the global landscape. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev became the Soviet leader, denouncing Stalin's policies and initiating reforms. Mao Zedong, a staunch follower of Stalin's policies, saw Khrushchev's actions as a betrayal of traditional communism and a threat to his leadership, which deepened the Sino-Soviet split. The Soviet Union, led by Leonid Brezhnev from 1964, strongly supported the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a communist stronghold in Southeast Asia, increasing military and economic aid to Vietnam. Mao feared the Soviet Union would expand its influence, undermining China's role in Southeast Asia. He warned that North Vietnam could manage without Soviet aid and relied on its strength to resist the United States. However, the Soviet Union continued to assist Vietnam with substantial aid, including tanks, aircraft, fuel, weapons, and advisors, and even anti-aircraft gunners who directly engaged U.S. forces. Faced with this situation, Mao Zedong felt compelled to increase China's support for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. From 1965 to 1968, China sent over 320,000 soldiers, including anti-aircraft units, allowing North Vietnam to deploy more troops in the south. However, Vietnam adopted a balancing strategy, seeking to maintain relationships with both China and the Soviet Union. This balance was disrupted when China shifted its foreign policy in the 1970s, forcing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to lean towards the Soviet Union. During the Paris Peace Accords, China, while not directly involved in the negotiations, continued to provide military and political support to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. However, China also sought to improve relations with the West, especially the United States. In 1971, the U.S. ping-pong team was invited to China, marking a turning point in U.S.-China relations, known as ping-pong diplomacy. In July 1971, Henry Kissinger secretly visited Beijing, followed by President Richard Nixon's historic visit in February 1972 to meet with Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai. Mao Zedong introduced the Three Worlds Theory, classifying the U.S. and Soviet Union as superpowers, other developed countries as the Second World, and developing nations, including China, as the Third World, championing their anti-imperialist efforts. This policy concerned Vietnam and other communist countries, as it suggested an alignment with the U.S. Despite Vietnam's prolonged efforts to balance the benefits of both China and the Soviet Union, China's stance forced Vietnam into a difficult choice. With deep-seated historical caution towards China and faced with China's contradictory actions, Vietnam leaned towards the Soviet Union. Fortunately, with remaining resources and a determined quest for independence, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam ultimately reunified the country. According to the China Quarterly, even Mao Zedong had to admit that his policies led to China's isolation, significantly weakening its international standing.